The Oklahoma sun beat down mercilessly on the dusty shooting range where James Mitchell had spent every Saturday morning for the past 3 years. At 22 years old, he was already considered one of the finest marksmen in the state, though few people outside his small town of Stillwater knew his name. His weathered hands moved with practiced precision as he loaded his grandfather's old Springfield rifle, a weapon that had seen action in the First World War and bore the scars to prove it. What made James different from other shooters wasn't just his aim. It was the modification he'd made to his rifle, a technique passed down from his grandfather who'd learned it in the trenches of France. A barn slit sight, they called it, a narrow, unconventional aperture that most modern shooters dismissed as outdated, even laughable. The opening was so thin it looked like the crack of light you'd see through a barn door left slightly ajar. Traditional shooters at the range would shake their heads when they saw it, whispering that the boy was wasting his talent on obsolete methods. James didn't care what they thought. His grandfather had taught him that sometimes the old ways worked better than all the fancy new equipment money could buy. The barn slit forced him to focus, to truly see his target rather than rely on modern optics that did half the work for you. It was meditation and muscle memory combined, a philosophy of shooting that demanded absolute presence of mind. On this particular Saturday in June 1941, the range was busier than usual. Word had spread that military recruiters would be observing the monthly competition, looking for potential recruits as tensions with Germany escalated. President Roosevelt's speeches had made it clear that American involvement in the war was no longer a question of if, but when. Young men across the country were preparing themselves, and those with shooting skills were particularly valuable. James's father, Thomas Mitchell, stood behind the firing line with his arms crossed. A veteran of the Great War himself, he bore a permanent limp from a piece of shrapnel that had torn through his left leg at Belleau Wood. He'd returned home with medals he never displayed and nightmares he never discussed. When James had first shown interest in shooting, Thomas had been reluctant, but eventually recognized that teaching his son might be the only way to keep those hard-earned lessons from dying with him. The competition began with 30 shooters, all of them eager to impress. The targets were set at 300 yards, standard military distance. One by one, the shooters took their positions. James watched as they fired, noting their techniques, their breathing patterns, the way they compensated for wind. Most scored well, some exceptionally so. There were men here with expensive rifles, state-of-the-art scopes, and years of formal training. When James's turn came, a ripple of whispers spread through the crowd. Lieutenant Robert Cunningham, the lead military recruiter, actually laughed when he saw the modified rifle. The barn slit sight looked primitive compared to the precision instruments the other competitors had used. Cunningham leaned over to his colleague and said something James couldn't hear, but the dismissive gesture that accompanied it spoke volumes. Thomas placed a hand on his son's shoulder. "Don't let them get in your head," he said quietly. "Show them what that old technique can do." James stepped up to the firing line, feeling the weight of his grandfather's rifle in his hands. He'd heard the laughter, seen the condescending looks. Part of him wanted to prove them all wrong right here and now. But his grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "A rifle doesn't care about pride, boy. It only responds to discipline and respect." He took his position, pressing his cheek against the worn stock. Through the barn slit, the world narrowed to a thin line of clarity. Everything else fell away, the whispers, the doubt, the hot Oklahoma wind. There was only the target, his breathing, and the ancient rhythm his body knew by heart. The first shot cracked across the range. Bullseye. The second followed before anyone could fully process the first. Another perfect hit. By the time James fired his 5th round, the whispers had stopped. By the 10th, Lieutenant Cunningham had moved closer to get a better look. James completed his round with 15 consecutive bullseyes, a perfect score that matched the best shooter of the day but had been achieved with what everyone had dismissed as obsolete equipment. Cunningham approached as James cleared his rifle. "I'll admit, son, I didn't expect that. That's some unconventional equipment you've got there." James met his eyes steadily. "My grandfather took out German snipers with this sight design at Chateau Thierry, sir. Worked pretty well for him." The lieutenant nodded slowly, clearly reassessing. Well, the Army's always looking for skilled marksmen, but they're not going to let you use that barn slit in combat. We've got standardized equipment, modern scopes. Before James could respond, his father stepped forward. Begging your pardon, Lieutenant, but maybe that's exactly the kind of thinking that got a lot of good men killed last time. Sometimes the old ways work better than you'd think. The conversation ended there, but the tension lingered. Cunningham took James's name and contact information, though his expression suggested it was more courtesy than genuine interest. As the crowd dispersed, James overheard two shooters talking near their trucks. That hillbilly thinks he can win a war with his grandpappy's pea shooter, one of them said, loud enough to be heard. Army's gonna laugh him right out of basic training. The words stung more than James wanted to admit. He'd grown up hearing stories of his grandfather's heroism, of how unconventional tactics and trusted methods had saved lives when fancy equipment failed. But maybe those days were gone. Maybe in this modern world, there was no place for the old techniques anymore. 3 weeks later, the letter arrived. James had been accepted into basic training at Fort Benning, Georgia, with a notation that he'd been flagged for potential sniper training due to his exceptional marksmanship scores. His father clapped him on the back with pride, but James felt a knot of anxiety forming in his stomach. He knew what was coming. He'd have to leave his grandfather's rifle behind, adopt military standard equipment, and prove himself all over again to instructors who would likely share Lieutenant Cunningham's skepticism. Basic training was exactly as brutal as promised. James excelled at marksmanship, consistently outperforming his fellow recruits even with the standard-issue rifles. But when he was selected for advanced sniper training and arrived at the specialized facility, he encountered Sergeant Robert Dawson, a career military man with 15 years of experience and zero patience for anything that deviated from protocol. During the first week, James made the mistake of mentioning his barn slit technique during a classroom session on sight alignment. Sergeant Dawson's face turned red with barely contained anger. "Mitchell," he barked, crossing the room in for long strides. "This is the United States Army, not your backwoods shooting club. We use proven, standardized methods here. Your grandfather's war is over. This is modern warfare, and it requires modern techniques. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Sergeant," James replied, standing at attention. But Dawson wasn't finished. "I've seen a dozen farm boys like you come through here thinking their deer hunting experience makes them snipers. It doesn't. That barn slit nonsense might work for tin cans on fence posts, but when you've got a German soldier with a Mauser K98 trained on your position, you'll wish you'd learned to shoot properly." The other trainees avoided eye contact with James after that. He'd been marked as the know-it-all country boy who thought he was smarter than military doctrine. His bunkmate, a shooter from Boston named Eddie Kowalski, pulled him aside that evening. "Listen, man, just keep your head down and do it their way. Dawson's got connections all the way up. He can wash you out of this program with one bad report, and you'll spend the rest of the war peeling potatoes in some mess hall. Is that really worth defending some old-timey shooting method?" James spent the next 2 months doing exactly what Eddie suggested. He kept his mouth shut, followed every instruction to the letter, and used the standard equipment without complaint. His scores remained excellent, consistently placing him in the top 3 of his training class. But something felt off. The connection he'd always felt with his weapon, that intimate understanding between shooter and rifle, had diminished. He was performing well by military standards, but he knew he wasn't shooting at his true potential. The turning point came on a cold November morning in 1942. The trainees had been assembled for a special demonstration by a visiting British officer, Captain Henry Whitmore of the King's Royal Rifle Corps. Whitmore had just returned from North Africa where British forces were engaged in brutal combat against Rommel's Afrika Korps. He'd been sent stateside to share intelligence about German sniper tactics and equipment. The captain was a thin man with haunted eyes and a quiet authority that commanded immediate respect. He didn't speak with the aggressive bravado of Sergeant Dawson. Instead, he described the reality of combat with clinical precision that made the room fall silent. "Gentlemen," Whitmore began, his British accent crisp in the morning air, "the Germans have some of the finest trained snipers in the world. They're patient, disciplined, and equipped with excellent optics. In North Africa, We lost 17 men to a single German sniper over the course of 4 days before we finally located and neutralized him. He paused, letting that sink in. Our standard scopes are good, but they have limitations. Glare from the sun can give away your position. The glass can fog in humid conditions. And if your scope takes a hit, even a minor one, you're essentially firing blind. Which is why some of our most successful snipers have started using alternative sighting methods, including some very old techniques. James felt his heart rate quicken. Whitmore pulled out a rifle and showed it to the group. This belonged to one of our best shooters, Corporal Davies. He modified it with what we call an aperture sight, very narrow opening. Some of the old-timers call it a barn door sight because of how thin the gap is. Sergeant Dawson shifted uncomfortably but said nothing in front of the visiting officer. Whitmore continued. Corporal Davies used this rifle to eliminate 9 German snipers in a 6-minute engagement outside Tobruk. 9 trained enemy combatants who had been terrorizing our positions for weeks. He did it because this sight doesn't glare, doesn't fog, and can't be knocked out of alignment easily. It requires more skill, certainly, but in the right hands, it's devastatingly effective. The room was absolutely silent now. James felt every eye in the room turn toward him, remembering his earlier humiliation. If you're watching this and thinking that old methods might have their place after all, stick around. This story is about to take a turn that even Sergeant Dawson didn't see coming. What happens next will change everything, not just for James, but for how the military thinks about conventional wisdom. After the demonstration, Captain Whitmore approached James directly. Sergeant Dawson had mentioned in his reports that one of the trainees had experience with aperture sights. That would be you, I presume? Yes, sir, James replied, standing straighter. My grandfather used a similar technique in the First War. Whitmore nodded thoughtfully. I'd like to see you shoot. Tomorrow morning, private range. Bring whatever equipment you feel most comfortable with. That evening, James wrote to his father asking him to send the old Springfield with the barn slit sight. The rifle arrived 3 days later, carefully packed with a note that simply read, "Make him proud." The next week unfolded like a dream James had barely dared to imagine. Whitmore spent hours working with him, not to change his technique but to refine it. The British captain understood what Sergeant Dawson never had. That true marksmanship wasn't about following a standardized formula, but about finding the method that allowed each shooter to perform at their absolute peak. Under Whitmore's guidance, James learned to adapt his grandfather's technique for modern combat scenarios. They practiced rapid target acquisition, shooting from unconventional positions, and maintaining accuracy under simulated stress conditions. The barn slit sight proved its worth again and again, particularly in situations where glare or environmental conditions compromised traditional scopes. Word spread quickly through the training facility. Other instructors came to observe. Some remained skeptical, but the targets didn't lie. James was consistently outperforming shooters with far more expensive and modern equipment. Sergeant Dawson watched these sessions from a distance, his jaw tight with obvious displeasure. Finally, he could contain himself no longer. He approached Whitmore during a water break. With respect, Captain, we have standardized training protocols for a reason. We can't have every recruit deciding they know better than established doctrine. Whitmore turned to face him, his expression pleasant but his tone carrying an edge of steel. Sergeant, I've spent the last 18 months watching good men die because they follow doctrine instead of adapting to reality. The Germans don't care about our training manuals. They care about killing us efficiently. If this young man has found a method that makes him more effective, then perhaps your doctrine needs updating rather than the other way around. The confrontation marked a shift in the camp's atmosphere. James was no longer the stubborn farm boy who didn't know his place. He became something else entirely. Proof that innovation and tradition could coexist, that the old ways his grandfather had trusted weren't relics to be discarded but tools to be respected. 2 months later, James graduated at the top of his sniper class. Captain Whitmore personally recommended him for immediate deployment to North Africa, where American forces were preparing for major operations against the Germans. Sergeant Dawson signed off on the orders without comment, though everyone present noticed he couldn't quite meet James's eyes during the graduation ceremony. James arrived in North Africa in March 1943, just as Allied forces were pushing toward Tunisia. The desert was nothing like Oklahoma. The heat was more intense, the terrain more unforgiving, and the stakes infinitely higher. This wasn't a competition on a controlled range. Every shot mattered. Every mistake could cost lives. He was assigned to a reconnaissance unit tasked with clearing German sniper nests that had been harassing supply convoys along a critical road near Gafsa. The German snipers were well-trained and patient, picking off drivers and officers with methodical precision. 3 American snipers had already been sent to neutralize them. None had returned. James's commanding officer, Lieutenant Marcus Hayes, was a pragmatic man from Chicago who cared more about results than methods. When he saw James's modified rifle, he didn't laugh or question it. He simply asked, "Can you shoot with that thing?" "Yes, sir. Better than with anything else." "Then let's see if you're as good as Whitmore says you are." The mission began before dawn. James moved through the rocky terrain with 3 spotters, searching for the German positions. The enemy snipers were hidden somewhere in the hills overlooking the supply route, but their exact locations remained unknown. Standard procedure would be to wait for them to fire and then try to spot the muzzle flash. But James had learned from his grandfather that patience could be a weapon too. He studied the landscape through his barn slit sight, looking not for soldiers but for the tiny details that betrayed human presence. A rock positioned too perfectly, a shadow that didn't quite match the angle of the sun, a patch of disturbed sand that suggested recent movement. "There," he whispered to his spotter, pointing to a position roughly 400 yards distant. "Second ridge, left side. See that overhang?" "I don't see anything. Trust me." James adjusted his position, controlled his breathing, and waited. Minutes passed. Then, barely visible, a glint of metal caught the morning light. A German sniper adjusting his position, probably preparing for the first convoy of the day. James fired. The German sniper slumped forward, his rifle clattering down the rocks. What followed was 6 minutes of the most intense shooting of James's life. The first shot had revealed his position, and the other German snipers immediately began hunting him. But James had the advantage of his unconventional sight. While they searched for scope glare, he moved and fired with devastating accuracy. The barn slit didn't reflect light. It didn't fog in the desert heat. It simply worked. When the engagement ended, 9 German snipers lay dead across 3 different ridge positions. James had eliminated an entire sniper unit that had been terrorizing American forces for 2 weeks. His spotters stared at him with something close to awe. Lieutenant Hayes recommended James for the Silver Star. The citation would eventually read, "For conspicuous gallantry and intrepidity in action against the enemy." But for James, the real validation came in a letter from his father weeks later. "Your grandfather would have been proud, son. You proved that the old ways still matter." 3 years after the war ended, James Mitchell stood in front of a classroom at Fort Benning, the same facility where Sergeant Dawson had once humiliated him for suggesting that unconventional methods had value. But the world had changed, and so had the Army's thinking. James was now Captain Mitchell, one of the youngest sniper instructors in military history. His techniques, once dismissed as outdated nonsense, were now part of the official curriculum. The barn slit sight had earned its place alongside modern optics, recognized not as a replacement but as a valuable alternative tool that worked exceptionally well in specific conditions. His first class of new recruits sat before him, eager and nervous in equal measure. James recognized that look. He'd worn it himself not so long ago. "Gentlemen," he began, walking along the front of the classroom, "the most important lesson I can teach you has nothing to do with equipment or technique. It's about understanding that there's rarely only one right way to accomplish a mission. The military needs standards, yes, but it also needs soldiers who can think critically and adapt when circumstances demand it." He held up his grandfather's Springfield rifle, now respectfully displayed in a glass case in his office but brought out for this moment. This rifle killed 9 German snipers in 6 minutes using a sighting method that many experts claimed was obsolete. It worked because I understood it completely, trained with it relentlessly, and trusted it when everything was on the line. One of the recruits raised his hand. "Sir, Is it true that Sergeant Dawson apologized to you after the North Africa mission? James smiled slightly. Sergeant Dawson wrote me a letter, yes. He admitted that he'd been wrong to dismiss techniques he didn't personally understand. That took courage, and I respected him for it. He's retired now, lives in Virginia. We exchanged Christmas cards. The classroom chuckled, the tension easing. After the class, James walked across the base to meet his father, who had driven down from Oklahoma for the weekend. Thomas Mitchell moved slower now, his war injury more pronounced with age, but his eyes were still sharp. They stood together at the base's memorial wall, reading the names of soldiers who hadn't made it home. James's grandfather's name was there, etched in stone alongside thousands of others. He'd be proud of what you've built here, Thomas said quietly. Not just because you proved everyone wrong, but because you're teaching these young men to think for themselves. That's the real legacy. James nodded, thinking about all the recruits he'd trained, the letters he'd received from soldiers serving around the world, the small but significant shift in military doctrine that his experience had helped create. That evening, back in his office, James began writing the next day's lesson plan. At the top of the page, he wrote a quote from his grandfather that his father had shared years ago. The best weapon is the one you understand completely and trust absolutely. Everything else is just decoration. Outside, the Georgia sun set over Fort Benning, casting long shadows across the ranges where a new generation of soldiers was learning that sometimes the most valuable innovations come from respecting the wisdom of the past.